Welcome to today's Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this because we are looking at a completely fascinating intersection of history, culture, and literature today. When you or I think of teenagers, we usually just assume it's this natural, universal fact of human biology, right? But what if I told you that the concept of the teenager, or adolescence as we know it, was actually invented? It's completely true. Through this wild mix of changing societal laws and the explosion of youth-led printing presses in the late 19th century, an entirely brand new stage of life was literally born. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how that happened and how it fundamentally changed the kinds of stories we tell. Here is the roadmap for our journey today. We'll be covering the invention of adolescence, the amateur journalism boom, the search for identity, the coming-of-age novel, and finally, expanding the adolescent experience. So, we have to start by answering this fundamental question. Have teenagers always existed? Well, biologically speaking, sure, humans have obviously always aged from childhood into adulthood. But culturally, not exactly. For the longest time, the timeline was pretty simple. You were a child, and then, boom, you were put to work and suddenly expected to be an adult. The whole idea of a specific, protected, and distinct teenage culture, complete with its own rules, its own networks, and, yeah, its own angst, that is a surprisingly modern invention. Section 1. The invention of adolescence. Back in the 1870s, society was going through some massive, ground-shifting structural changes. Industrialization was completely altering the landscape of work, and as a direct response to that, we started seeing the rise of compulsory schooling laws, along with new minimum age laws that restricted child labor. To put that into perspective, by the year 1900, 31 states had made school attendance totally mandatory for kids from age 8 all the way to 14. And what that meant was that a huge wave of middle-class youth were suddenly being held out of the workforce en masse. Basically, they were pushed into this brand new waiting room of life. They were way too old to be treated like little kids, but they weren't legally allowed to start their adult careers yet. And to capture this bizarre new reality, these young people latched onto the term amateur. Now, earlier in the century, that word just meant doing something because you loved it, right? Like a hobby. But these youths aggressively redefined it to mean something hyper-specific. To them, an amateur was an age-based category. It meant a boy editor or a young person publishing a small newspaper. It explicitly meant you were not a professional adult. By claiming that word, they basically carved out a totally distinct identity for themselves, separated entirely from the adult professional workforce. Moving on to Section 2, the amateur journalism boom. Take a look at this incredible historical artifact. This is a paper called Our Venture, and it was published in Ohio back in September 1869. Prior to 1867, amateur youth newspapers were incredibly rare, usually just handwritten or made on clunky homemade presses. But right after the Civil War, affordable toy printing presses hit the market, and they cost anywhere from $15 to $50. Suddenly, the number of amateur youth newspapers skyrocketed. We're talking going from fewer than 100 to almost 1,000. These kids are producing 4-page issues absolutely packed with serial fiction, poetry, and fiery editorials. They were completely emulating the professional adult world, but the whole operation was 100% controlled by youth. And let me tell you, they were remarkably sophisticated. On one side, we have The Pen, published in 1879 by Virginia Stevens. She was this incredibly vocal amateur from Massachusetts who wrote these elegant, hard-hitting editorials, including pieces arguing that women should receive equal pay for equal work. And on the other side is Merry Moments, published in 1869 by Charles Scribner II in New York. Get this, he was the 15-year-old son of the famous publisher, running his very own paper. It just goes to show the massive geographic reach and the serious intellectual debates that were happening within this teenage network, a network they very fondly referred to as amateurdom. Just to prove to you how tightly bound to adolescence this whole movement really was, an 1873 guide gives us the demographics, and it reveals this perfect bell curve that peaks right between the ages of 15 and 18. This definitely wasn't an activity for little kids, and it absolutely wasn't for adults. In fact, and I love this, when these editors aged into their 20s, the younger teenagers started calling them fossils and actively debated whether they even belonged in the network anymore. It was just a hyper-specific, fiercely protected teenage phenomenon. They even went as far as building their own economy. Notice the advertising space on the back page of the Victor here from 1879? These kids were selling ad space, they were trading used type, offering job printing services to local businesses, and running subscription contests. These advertising sections visually prove how vibrant and interconnected these young editors were. They were establishing this collective peer culture and public life well over a century before social media was even a blip on the radar. Which brings us to Section 3, the search for identity.
So, on one side of the coin, we have the external historical causes that were holding them out of the adult world, things like compulsory schooling and the massive reduction of child labor. But internally, these kids were dealing with some very powerful psychological needs. Completely cut off from the immediate responsibilities of adult life, these youths deeply craved belonging, love, and esteem. They developed this intense concern for self, and they sought out vital affirmation primarily through their peers. These newspapers weren't just some cute hobby. They were literally a way to forge an identity and build self-esteem in a world that was changing at lightning speed.
Section 4, the coming-of-age novel. So how did the adult world make sense of this? Literature started reflecting this new life stage through something called the Bildungsroman. It's a big German word, but it basically refers to a coming-of-age novel where a youth breaks away from their family to seek out independence. They go on this journey, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, that ultimately leads to an epiphany. You know, that massive, life-changing light bulb moment? That realization signals their maturity, it solidifies their personal identity, and it pushes them right toward adulthood. It is the absolute perfect literary encapsulation of the whole adolescent experience. And you can actually track the evolution of this genre over time. It essentially kicks off with early American autobiographies, like Benjamin Franklin's in 1791, where he literally runs away from his family to find his own path. Later on, Louisa May Alcott's Little Women in 1868 gave us some of the very first coming-of-age fiction specifically tailored for girls. Then, of course, we get Mark Twain's absolute classic Huckleberry Finn in 1884. Fast forward to the 1950s, and we see an absolute explosion of works focusing purely on the emotional and psychological angst of youth. Think JD Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye and William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Mark Twain's work is honestly the perfect example of how literature mirrored this adolescent conflict. In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck, who is an abused runaway, takes a trip down the river with Jim, an escaped slave. The text sets up this really profound conflict for him. Huck has to choose between obeying the laws of his human society, which permit slavery, and the laws of nature, under which all people are born free. Huck's ultimate decision to support Jim's freedom, that marks his personal epiphany. His conflict isn't just an internal struggle, it's a conflict with his entire culture and environment, and it results in a completely new, mature outlook on life. And finally, Section 5, expanding the adolescent experience. There was a massive, radical shift in public attitude in the 20th century, particularly after 1960. It finally allowed authors to tackle subjects that were previously considered entirely taboo for youth. We're talking real issues like divorce, mental illness, and physical abuse. This gave rise to social realism, which featured teens who felt completely out of step with society. And from there, the adolescent experience branched out wildly. You had sports stories dealing with heavy ethical dilemmas, mysteries where teens navigated suspense alongside really complex peer relationships, rich romances, and even epic fantasy. Books like Ursula K. Le Guin's Earth series, which essentially function as massive, multi-book coming-of-age stories. But ultimately, whether we're talking about an 1870s teenager furiously printing an editorial to defend their reputation, or a fictional teen wizard battling dark forces in a magical school, there is one major unifying thread: the absolute core of the adolescent experience, both in our real history and in our literature, is facing conflicts and difficult situations, all to discover a true aspect of one's identity. I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought today. Those 1870s teenagers, held out of the workforce, used newly affordable toy printing presses to build the very first teenage public sphere. They connected, they argued, and they shaped their identities through ink and paper. So, if that was the catalyst back then, what is the modern equivalent shaping youth identity today? Are today's digital platforms essentially the new toy presses? It's definitely a fascinating question to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.